Hey guys, welcome to Combs Design. I am so excited about today's build. And you might have figured it out from the title already, but today's build is actually a piece of furniture based around Pythagoras. Now you might know him from middle school or high school with the Pythagorean Theorem, and that is certainly part of this build, but I also took into account the theory of proportions that he came up with, and you'll see in the base how the Pythagorean Theorem and the theory of proportions came into play. Now, if you're a student who stumbled upon my video wanting to learn about the Pythagorean Theorem, I will actually explain that at the end of the video for you, and you can skip ahead if you want, but I encourage you to stick around. So far, all I've been doing is milling up my lumber. You'll see that I've already gone to the jointer, and now I'm cutting my boards down to length. Cutting them down to length at this stage in the milling process is great, especially in a small shop. It makes the boards a lot easier to work with and move around within the shop. And before we keep going into this project, I want to give a quick shout out to my boy Davey over at QuoteArtisan. He provided some artwork that I use later in this video when I'm staging the piece. He has a bunch of great pieces over on Etsy, and he's actually providing some pieces for some future builds. And I'll put a link in the description of where you can go and check out his artwork. I promise you won't regret it. He has some really great pieces. Now back in the build, you'll see I'm arranging my boards how I want and marking them so I can find that alignment later. And you'll see I'm marking all of my seams between my boards as in and out. And this is a technique that I learned from Shaun on his channel, and it requires a whole video of its own to really explain and get into. So I'll just link to that because he's already made it. Now all that's left is gluing up my tabletop. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It really helps me continue to make free content like this on YouTube. Subscribing is really the best thing you can do for me and other content creators you love on YouTube if you want them to keep making content for you to enjoy. Now that my tabletop is dry, I can go ahead and square it up. I did this by taking one of my flat reference edges against my miter gauge and running it through the table saw. Once I verified that I'd created a right angle, I went ahead and flipped the piece and ran it through the table saw again so I can have two straight edges. A great way to verify that your tabletop is actually square is to measure corner to corner from both sides. And if your measurements are the same, it means you have a square piece. Next, I went and took my 8/4 walnut, cut it down at the miter saw, and I had to flip it because my miter saw is too small. Ran it through the joiner, and then took it over to the table saw to cut 1 inch by 1 inch strips that'll make up the base. Once I cut the lengths I needed, I began my main layout. And this is the first rectangle, and then I'll have two intersecting pieces that go into it. I used dowel and glue assembly, and you'll see that I marked my lines, lined up my doweling jig, and drilled my holes for my 1/2 inch dowels. Now all that was left was to assemble this with the dowels, put it in clamps, and let it dry. Once my piece was dry, I was able to mark the center of the main leg assembly, as well as the center of the table, and start getting things lined up so I could verify my dimensions. In this particular instance, my measurements were really at the mercy of the raw Wenge pieces that I used to make up my top. Once I saw what my final dimensions for the top were, I was able to make my measurements and decide what size my legs were going to be. In this particular build, I had a rough idea of what size I wanted this table to be, but I was really at the mercy of the raw lumber because I didn't have an exact final dimension I was shooting for. Wenge for the top and hard maple for the bottom contrasted beautifully, and I'm really happy with the color combination of this piece. Because my legs sit at an angle to the faces of the top, you'll see that the Pythagorean Theorem to figure out my measurements, as well as the theory of proportions, really came in handy to make this piece look good. Now that I had all my pieces together, I went ahead and cleaned up the top, first removing the glue squeeze out and then sanding all the way to 220 grit. I filled in all the holes with an epoxy that had a black dye mixed in, and once that had dried and been smoothed out, I did 3 coats of a wipe-on poly. After the first 2 coats, I waited for it to completely dry, then sanded with 220 grit sandpaper very lightly before I applied my 3rd coat. One thing I won't show here, but I did on the tabletop after the third coat, is I sanded with the same micro mesh pads that I used on the lathe project from a few weeks ago. This got me a really smooth top, and I'm really happy with the way that finish came out. I wet sanded from 1500 to 12,000 grit with the micro mesh. I then used figure 8 tabletop clamps to attach the base to the top, and I was all done.